guys, welcome back to my channel, and I know what you're thinking. Boy, this production level has really gone downhill. And you wouldn't be wrong. I've had to change back to using my phone instead of my camera. I'm also in a completely different location because I've moved. The lighting's gonna be a bit weird for this video, as you can see by the really dramatic shadows. What are you doing? This is my baby girl, this is Roku. Today I'm going to show you two different ways to make hair scrunchies. The first way is completely hand sewn, and the second way involves using a machine. Visually, there's not that much of a difference between the two. It just depends on what materials you have available for your craft. The first scrunchie I'm going to show you how to make is the hand sewn one. The first thing you're going to want to do is take your hair tie and measure from end to end. Mine is 2.5 inches, which means that the full length of the hair tie, if it was laid out straight, is 5 inches. Next, you're going to measure out the piece of fabric that you'll be using to make your scrunchie. Since my scrunchie is 5 inches long, I'm going to go ahead and multiply that number by 2 to get 10, and then add in about 3 more inches to get 13. I'm going to measure out and mark a piece of fabric that is 13 by 3 inches. I'm marking my fabric using a white chalk, which will rub off as time passes. My marks are very difficult to see on camera, but make sure that yours are visible on your fabric and will come off. Go ahead and cut out that fabric. Fold your fabric in half, right sides together. Match up the edges of your fabric and pin them together. Thread your needle with a very similar color to your fabric. You want your stitches to be super strong, so double over your thread. You should end up with 2 long, equally sized tails coming out of the end of your needle. Do not put a knot in the end of your threads. We're going to actually make the knot in the fabric itself. About 1/4 inch away from the edge, take a very, very tiny amount of fabric under your needle, like so. Pull through until you're about 3 inches from the edge of your thread, and that same super tiny stitch in the same spot. Make that stitch one more time. This will create a knot that will prevent your thread from pulling through the fabric. Now do a running stitch 1/4 inch away from the edge of your fabric, and at the end make the same knot that you did here and cut off leaving a 3-inch tail. You should now have a tube of fabric that looks like this. Take your fingers and open up the seam, pressing down the center of it. If you want, you can iron this down, but I find that the pressure from your fingers is fine for such a small piece. Take your fabric and fold it in half again, this time matching up the 2 long raw edges. What you're going to do is you're going to take your hair tie, tuck it into your fabric, and pin the edge of it so that your hair tie is trapped within that fold. Continue pinning in this manner all the way around your loop of fabric. As you go, you'll notice that you have to start scrunching up the fabric in order to fit it around your hair tie. This is normal. Once you've pinned your fabric all the way around the edge, you should end up with something like this. There's still one more step before we can sew this seam. What we're going to do is take out one of your pins, fold over both of the edges of your fabric so that they face towards the hair tie, pin them in place. And you're going to do this all the way around the edge of your hair tie. Once you've finished folding over your raw edges, your scrunchie should look like this. Thread up your needle the same way as before, making sure that you do not knot the ends and that your thread is folded over on itself. Take your needle, insert it through a random point in the fabric, and have it exit at the very top edge of the seam. Pull your thread until the very end of it just goes through that first entrance. Create a tiny knot by stitching a very, very tiny stitch over the same spot 2 or 3 times. Now you're going to do a stitch that is either called slip stitch or ladder stitch. Take your needle and put it through the very edge of the fabric on one side of your seam in a small stitch like this. At the same point where that stitch ends, put your needle into the other side of that fabric, take a tiny stitch and then pull it all the way through. Continue this all the way around the edge of your scrunchie, removing pins as you go. Once you come back to the point that you've started at, go ahead and make a tiny little knot again. Then take your needle, put it through the top edge, have it come out somewhere near the bottom. Cut your thread pretty short, and there you are. Your hand-sewn scrunchie is complete. Next up, I'm going to show you how to make a machine-made scrunchie. I find that this kind of method leads to a lot more creativity as it's quite fast and you can use thicker fabric to create your design. Start out by cutting yourself a piece of elastic the length you want your finished scrunchie to be. Now, you can cut it to be the same length as the average hair tie, which would be about 5 inches, but because my hair is a little bit thicker, I'm actually going to cut mine out to 6 inches. Next, you're going to mark and cut your fabric the exact same way that you did the other fabric. That is, take the length of your elastic, which in my case is 6 inches, double it, 12 inches, add 2 or 3 inches, which I'm going to do 14. For this scrunchie, I'd actually like for it to be a bit wider than the other one, so I'm going to go ahead and cut it out to 4 inches instead of 3. Go ahead and cut out your fabric to your desired size. Make sure that you're making your markings on the wrong side of your fabric. This time, take your fabric and fold it in hot dog style. Match the edges up and pin them together. Thread your machine up with a matching thread. In this case, I'm using black. So, using a straight stitch 1/4 inch away from the edge of your fabric. Be sure to back stitch at both the beginning and the end of your seam line. Now that you've finished that seam, go ahead and turn your fabric right side out. I will say it is a lot easier to turn your fabric right side out if you make a wider scrunchie. Now you're going to thread your elastic through your tube of fabric. The easiest way to thread this through is to take a pin one side of the elastic to your tube, and then to take a safety pin, put through the other end of the elastic, and grip the safety pin through the fabric as you guide it along the tube. Now that you have the elastic sticking out both ends of your scrunchie, match them up at the edge, overlapping them just a little bit, and put a pin through them to hold them in place. A straight stitch over that seam, going back and forth about 4 or 5 times. Secure it in place. Now all that's left is to seal up this gap in your scrunchie. The way you do this is by taking one side, holding the edge to the inside, and taking the other side of the fabric and putting it inside the other one. Carefully pin each side of the fabric together. Remember, you still want this fabric to remain a tube. Put your needle and double over the thread. Do not tie a knot in the ends. Put your needle into the fabric at a random point and pull it up out of the fabric right next to your seam. Now you're going to create a small knot, making a tiny stitch right where your needle just came through, and repeating that same stitch in that same spot 2 or 3 times. In order to complete this hair tie, you're going to take your needle, put a tiny stitch in the fabric on the left side of the seam, then take it and put a tiny stitch on the right side of the seam. Go ahead and continue that around your scrunchie, being careful not to squish it down, as that will cause it to stop being a tube. Once you've returned to your starting point, go ahead and make a tiny little knot by making your super tiny stitches, putting your needle into your fabric, and then pulling it out at a random spot. Then cut your fabric. Not your fabric. Cut your thread. And there you have it. These are your 2 different methods of how to make a scrunchie. I hope this was helpful to you. If you make this yourself, please link me to your image so that I can have a look. I love seeing what you make from my tutorials. Thank you very much for watching. Say hi to everyone. Hi. I was a princess. This is what I have to deal with.